But Mrs. Carter wasn't convinced. She turned away from the window, setting her teacup down on the table with a sharp clink. "I don't like it," she muttered. "It's too much. We've never had this kind of ruckus around here before." Ignoring her son's eye roll, she picked up the phone and dialed the local police station. Her voice took on a clipped, authoritative tone as she spoke. "Yes, hello," she began. "I'd like to report a disturbance. There's a large gathering a few houses down at the Thompsons' residence. It's quite loud, and there are a lot of unfamiliar faces. I'm just concerned, that's all. Better safe than sorry." After hanging up, Mrs. Carter felt a sense of satisfaction. She believed she was doing the right thing, keeping her neighborhood safe and quiet. But what she didn't realize was the storm she had just set in motion. Back at the Thompsons' house, Ethan was sitting at the head of a table, a look of pure delight on his face as he stared at his birthday cake. It was a masterpiece, a three-tiered creation adorned with bright blue frosting and topped with a figurine of Ethan's favorite superhero. The guests gathered around, their voices blending into a cheerful rendition of Happy Birthday. Charlotte stood beside Nathaniel, their hands intertwined as they watched their son prepare to blow out the candles. "Make a wish, sweetheart," Charlotte said softly, her voice full of love. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, then took a deep breath and blew out the candles. The guests erupted into applause, and Ethan's face split into a wide grin. It was a moment of pure happiness, a memory that Charlotte hoped Ethan would carry with him forever. But just as Charlotte was about to cut the cake, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. The laughter and chatter of the guests quieted, and she saw several people looking toward the street. Her smile faltered as she followed their gaze. Nathaniel's brow furrowed in confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, stepping closer to the edge of the yard. Charlotte's heart sank as she saw what everyone was looking at. 3 police cars had pulled up to the curb, their lights flashing red and blue. The officers stepped out, their expressions serious, hands resting on their belts as if bracing for trouble. Nathaniel's protective instinct kicked in, and he moved to stand in front of Charlotte. "Stay with Ethan," he whispered, his voice tense. Charlotte nodded, pulling her son close as she tried to keep her composure. The perfect day, filled with laughter and love, was suddenly overshadowed by a sense of fear and uncertainty. What could have prompted this intrusion? It was a question that lingered in the air, heavy and unanswered, as the officers made their way toward the backyard. The storm was just beginning, and the Thompson family had no idea how quickly the day's joy would turn into a fight for their dignity and peace. The uninvited guests. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the Thompson family's backyard. What had begun as a bright, joyous celebration now felt like a scene suspended in an uneasy silence. The laughter and conversations had faded into a low murmur as the 3 police officers made their way toward the gathering, their expressions stern and unreadable. Charlotte held Ethan's hand tightly, her pulse quickening. She could feel the eyes of her friends and family on her, searching her face for some indication of what was happening. She looked over at Nathaniel, who was already moving to intercept the officers. His normally warm and welcoming expression was replaced by one of controlled concern. Nathaniel stepped forward, his shoulders squared as he addressed the lead officer, a tall man with a chiseled jawline and a crisp uniform. The officer's name tag read Morrison. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a hardened face that had clearly seen many years of service. Behind him, 2 younger officers stood slightly apart, scanning the crowd with a mix of caution and curiosity. "Good afternoon, officers," Nathaniel began, forcing a polite smile onto his face despite the tension he felt. "Is there a problem?" "This is just a birthday party for our son." Officer Morrison adjusted his stance, his hand resting on his belt as he regarded Nathaniel with an expression that was hard to read. "We received a call about a disturbance," he said matter-of-factly. "A report of loud noise and unfamiliar individuals in the area. We're just here to check things out." Nathaniel blinked in surprise, glancing back at the crowd. Most of the guests were familiar faces, neighbors and friends from work. The only people who might have seemed unfamiliar were a few of Charlotte's colleagues and some new friends Ethan had made at school. He looked back at the officer, trying to keep his voice steady. The perfect day. The sun cast its golden light over the Thompson family's backyard, illuminating a scene of sheer joy and celebration. It was a warm summer afternoon, the kind that felt like it stretched forever, promising endless hours of fun and laughter. Today was a special day for the Thompson family. It was Ethan's 7th birthday, a milestone his parents, Charlotte and Nathaniel, had been planning for weeks. The backyard was a kaleidoscope of colors. Streamers in shades of blue, red, and yellow hung from the trees, fluttering in the gentle breeze. Tables were set up with an array of sweet treats, cupcakes with vibrant frosting, bowls of jelly beans, and a massive jug of homemade lemonade. The centerpiece of the yard was a giant bouncy castle, its inflatable walls wobbling as children jumped and tumbled inside, their giggles ringing out like music. Charlotte, dressed in a light pink summer dress, watched her son with a smile. Her dark curls framed her face, and her eyes sparkled with the contentment of a mother seeing her child's pure happiness. Ethan ran up to her, his face flushed with excitement, clutching a balloon sword he had just received from a friendly clown. "Look, Mom, I got the best sword ever," Ethan exclaimed, his eyes wide with joy. Charlotte knelt to his level, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "It's amazing, sweetheart. Did you thank the nice lady who made it for you?" Ethan nodded enthusiastically. "I did. She said it's the best one she's made today." "Well, I think she's right," Charlotte replied, planting a gentle kiss on his cheek. She looked around at the backyard, filled with friends, family, and a chorus of laughter. It was everything she had hoped for. Nearby, Nathaniel was mingling with the guests, his smile as broad as ever. Nathaniel, dressed in a crisp white polo shirt and khaki shorts, was the picture of a proud father. He moved from group to group, shaking hands, sharing jokes, and making sure everyone had enough to eat and drink. For him, this wasn't just a birthday party. It was a celebration of his family, of the life they had built together. As he caught Charlotte's eye, he gave her a wink, his face lighting up with a grin. Ethan's grandparents, Charlotte's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, had also joined the celebration. They stood by the snack table, chatting with old friends and marveling at how quickly their grandson was growing up. Mr. Wilson, a tall man with a full head of silver hair, had a hearty laugh that could be heard across the yard. His wife, a petite woman with kind eyes, smiled fondly as she watched Ethan run circles around them. Mrs. Wilson leaned into her husband. "Look at him, George. He's growing so fast. Feels like just yesterday we were here celebrating Charlotte's birthdays." George Wilson nodded, his eyes crinkling with a smile. "Time flies, doesn't it? But look at him, full of energy, just like his mother was at his age." They shared a nostalgic smile, their hearts swelling with pride. The circle of life was continuing before their eyes. They had raised Charlotte, and now they were watching her raise Ethan with the same love and care they had once given her. As the day wore on, more guests arrived. Friends from Charlotte's workplace, a few neighbors, and some of Nathaniel's colleagues joined in. It was a lively gathering, a diverse mix of people coming together to celebrate Ethan's special day. Children played games, got their faces painted, and raced around the yard, their laughter blending with the soft background music playing from a small speaker near the patio. But as the party buzzed with excitement, not everyone in the neighborhood shared the Thompsons' joy. Just a few houses down, Mrs. Carter, a longtime resident, was watching the scene unfold from her window. Her face, usually set in a frown, looked even more disapproving than usual. With her silver hair pulled back into a tight bun and her lips pressed into a thin line, she peered out, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the gathering. Mrs. Carter had lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years. She had seen it change and evolve, but she preferred things the way they used to be, quiet, orderly, and filled with familiar faces. Today, as she watched the Thompsons' party, her discomfort grew. There were too many unfamiliar faces, too much noise. It felt like her world was being invaded by strangers. Her son, Richard, who had stopped by to drop off some groceries, noticed her staring out the window. He walked over, glancing outside to see what had captured her attention. "Mom, what's going on?" Richard asked, his tone more curious than concerned. Mrs. Carter's lips tightened further. "Look at that," she said, pointing toward the Thompsons' house. "All these people. I don't recognize half of them. Who knows where they've come from?" Richard rolled his eyes. "It's just a birthday party, Mom. You're overthinking it." But Mrs. Carter wasn't convinced. She turned away from the window, setting her teacup down on the table with a sharp clink. "I don't like it," she muttered. "It's too much. We've never had this kind of ruckus around here before." Ignoring her son's eye roll, she picked up the phone and dialed the local police station. Her voice took on a clipped, authoritative tone as she spoke. "Yes, hello," she began. "I'd like to report a disturbance. There's a large gathering a few houses down at the Thompsons' residence. It's quite loud, and there are a lot of unfamiliar faces. I'm just concerned, that's all. Better safe than sorry." After hanging up, Mrs. Carter felt a sense of satisfaction. She believed she was doing the right thing, keeping her neighborhood safe and quiet. But what she didn't realize was the storm she had just set in motion. Back at the Thompsons' house, Ethan was sitting at the head of a table, a look of pure delight on his face as he stared at his birthday cake. It was a masterpiece, a three-tiered creation adorned with bright blue frosting and topped with a figurine of Ethan's favorite superhero. The guests gathered around, their voices blending into a cheerful rendition of Happy Birthday. Charlotte stood beside Nathaniel, their hands intertwined as they watched their son prepare to blow out the candles. "Make a wish, sweetheart," Charlotte said softly, her voice full of love. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, then took a deep breath and blew out the candles. The guests erupted into applause, and Ethan's face split into a wide grin. It was a moment of pure happiness, a memory that Charlotte hoped Ethan would carry with him forever. But just as Charlotte was about to cut the cake, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. The laughter and chatter of the guests quieted, and she saw several people looking toward the street. Her smile faltered as she followed their gaze. Nathaniel's brow furrowed in confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, stepping closer to the edge of the yard. Charlotte's heart sank as she saw what everyone was looking at. 3 police cars had pulled up to the curb, their lights flashing red and blue. The officers stepped out, their expressions serious, hands resting on their belts as if bracing for trouble. Nathaniel's protective instinct kicked in, and he moved to stand in front of Charlotte. "Stay with Ethan," he whispered, his voice tense. Charlotte nodded, pulling her son close as she tried to keep her composure. The perfect day, filled with laughter and love, was suddenly overshadowed by a sense of fear and uncertainty. What could have prompted this intrusion? It was a question that lingered in the air, heavy and unanswered, as the officers made their way toward the backyard. The storm was just beginning, and the Thompson family had no idea how quickly the day's joy would turn into a fight for their dignity and peace. The uninvited guests. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the Thompson family's backyard. What had begun as a bright, joyous celebration now felt like a scene suspended in an uneasy silence. The laughter and conversations had faded into a low murmur as the 3 police officers made their way toward the gathering, their expressions stern and unreadable. Charlotte held Ethan's hand tightly, her pulse quickening. She could feel the eyes of her friends and family on her, searching her face for some indication of what was happening. She looked over at Nathaniel, who was already moving to intercept the officers. His normally warm and welcoming expression was replaced by one of controlled concern. Nathaniel stepped forward, his shoulders squared as he addressed the lead officer, a tall man with a chiseled jawline and a crisp uniform. The officer's name tag read Morrison. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a hardened face that had clearly seen many years of service. Behind him, two younger officers stood slightly apart, scanning the crowd with a mix of caution and curiosity. "Good afternoon, officers," Nathaniel began, forcing a polite smile onto his face despite the tension he felt. "Is there a problem? This is just a birthday party for our son." Officer Morrison adjusted his stance, his hand resting on his belt as he regarded Nathaniel with an expression that was hard to read. "We received a call about a disturbance," he said matter-of-factly. "A report of loud noise and unfamiliar individuals in the area. We're just here to check things out." Nathaniel blinked in surprise, glancing back at the crowd. Most of the guests were familiar faces, neighbors and friends from work. The only people who might have seemed unfamiliar were a few of Charlotte's colleagues and some new friends Ethan had made at school. He looked back at the officer, trying to keep his voice steady. "With all due respect, officer," Nathaniel said, "this is just a children's birthday party. We're celebrating with friends and family. I don't see why that would warrant a police visit." Officer Morrison's expression remained unchanged, but there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes, as if he too sensed the awkwardness of the situation. He glanced over at his colleagues, who were still scanning the scene, their hands hovering near their service weapons. "It's standard procedure," Morrison replied, his tone clipped. "When a call is made, we're required to investigate. We've been informed that there were unfamiliar individuals in the area, and given the nature of the report, we have to take a look." Charlotte stepped forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Unfamiliar individuals," she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "What does that even mean?" "This is a diverse community, and our guests come from different backgrounds. Are you implying that because some of our friends might not look like the usual neighbors, they're suspicious?" A brief, uncomfortable silence fell between them. Morrison hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Ma'am, we're not here to make any assumptions," he said finally. "We just want to make sure everything is in order." Nathaniel's jaw tightened as he sensed the underlying implication. He had seen this kind of situation play out before. An overreaction based on preconceived notions, a response driven by suspicion, rather than any real concern. He glanced back at Charlotte, seeing the hurt and frustration in her eyes, and knew they had to handle this carefully. "Feel free to look around," Nathaniel said, stepping aside slightly, gesturing toward the yard. "But as you can see, it's just kids playing, families chatting, and a little celebration for a 7-year-old. Morrison gave a curt nod and motioned for the two younger officers to disperse and take a look around. They moved cautiously through the yard, their presence drawing the attention of the guests, who were now openly staring, whispering among themselves. The joyous atmosphere had soured, replaced by an uncomfortable tension. As one of the officers approached the snack table, Mr. Wilson, who had been watching the scene unfold, decided to step in. Despite his age, he still carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had seen much in his life. He walked over, his hand outstretched in a gesture of greeting. "Good afternoon, officer," Mr. Wilson said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm George Wilson, the birthday boy's grandfather. Is there something we can assist you with?" The young officer looked taken aback for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Just following up on a report, sir," he said, "making sure there's no disturbance." George's eyes narrowed slightly, a knowing look passing over his face. He had seen this before, the quiet, insidious racism that could hide behind polite words and standard procedures. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice even. "A report about what?" George asked pointedly. "I've been standing here the whole time, and all I've seen is kids having fun and parents chatting. If this is about noise, it's hardly louder than any other gathering we've had here." The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to respond. He mumbled something about it being just routine before quickly moving on. George watched him go, shaking his head in disbelief. Meanwhile, Charlotte had moved back to Ethan, who was clutching her hand, his earlier excitement replaced by confusion and fear. "Mom, why are the police here?" he asked in a small voice, looking up at her with wide, innocent eyes. Charlotte's heart broke a little at the question. She knelt down to his level, cupping his face in her hands. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly. "They're just making sure everything is safe. Don't worry about it. We're going to cut your cake soon, and you'll get to blow out your candles." Ethan nodded, but he still looked unsure. Charlotte hugged him tightly, wishing she could shield him from this ugliness. This was supposed to be his special day, a memory filled with joy, not one marred by fear and suspicion. As the officers continued their sweep of the yard, they eventually regrouped near the entrance, speaking in low voices. Officer Morrison looked back at Nathaniel and Charlotte, his expression a mix of discomfort and professional detachment. "It appears everything is fine here," Morrison said, almost grudgingly. "We apologize for the interruption." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "Fine," he echoed. "You came here because a neighbor made a complaint about our guests being unfamiliar. Let me guess, it was Mrs. Carter." The officer's slight hesitation confirmed it. Nathaniel's face hardened. "She's been looking for a reason to cause trouble for us since we moved here. I hope you understand how this looks. You responding to a baseless complaint and disrupting our child's birthday party." Morrison's jaw tightened. "We have to follow up on reports made by residents, sir," he said. "We don't have the luxury of ignoring calls. But you do have the discretion to decide whether a situation warrants 3 police cars and officers ready for a confrontation." Nathaniel shot back, his voice rising slightly. Charlotte laid a hand on Nathaniel's arm, her touch calming him slightly. "We understand you have a job to do," she said, her voice measured. "But I hope you can see how this affects us. This is our home, our family. And now our son's birthday has been tainted by this unnecessary intrusion." Morrison looked at her for a long moment, the tension between them palpable. Finally, he gave a short nod. "I understand your frustration, ma'am," he said quietly. "We'll be leaving now. Again, we apologize for the inconvenience." With that, the officers turned and made their way back to their cars. The murmurs of the guests slowly grew louder as people began to relax, though the earlier joy had been replaced by a simmering anger and discomfort. Charlotte and Nathaniel stood together, watching the police cars pull away. Ethan clung to his mother's dress, looking up at his parents with wide, worried eyes. "Is it over?" he asked in a small voice. Charlotte knelt down, pulling him into her arms. "Yes, sweetie," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's over. Now, let's go cut your cake." But as they made their way back to the table, the unease lingered in the air. The perfect day had been marred by an intrusion that had no place here. It was a stark reminder of the prejudices that still lingered beneath the surface, even in their seemingly perfect suburban neighborhood. As Charlotte took the knife to cut the cake, her hands trembled slightly. She glanced at Nathaniel, who gave her a reassuring nod. They had weathered this storm together, but she knew deep down that the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a deeper conversation they would have to face, with their neighbors, their community, and eventually, even with their young son. The cake was cut, and Ethan blew out his candles, the cheers of their friends and family ringing out once more. But the laughter felt a little forced, the smiles a bit strained. The shadow of the uninvited guests lingered over the party, a reminder of the day when a joyful celebration had been disrupted by the ugliness of prejudice and suspicion. The aftermath and rising tensions. As the police cars disappeared down the street, the Thompson family's backyard felt suspended in an awkward silence. The guests, who had moments ago been laughing and chatting, now exchanged uncertain glances, their faces etched with confusion and frustration. It was as if a dark cloud had rolled in, casting a shadow over what had been a joyful celebration. Nathaniel stood by the gate, his hands clenched into fists. He watched the taillights of the police vehicles until they vanished from sight, his chest heaving with a mixture of anger and helplessness. He had hoped this kind of incident would never touch his family. especially not on a day meant to celebrate his son's happiness. The sting of being treated with suspicion in their own home left him simmering. Charlotte, sensing her husband's inner turmoil, gently placed a hand on his arm. He turned to look at her, and in her eyes, he saw the same pain and confusion reflected back at him. "I can't believe this happened," she said softly, her voice trembling. "In our own backyard, Nathaniel. On Ethan's birthday." Nathaniel exhaled a slow, deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I know," he replied, his voice raw with emotion. "But we can't let this ruin the day for him. Let's try to get back to the party. We'll deal with the rest later." Charlotte nodded, though her heart felt heavy. Together, they made their way back to the party, forcing smiles onto their faces. As they approached the cake table, their friends and family gathered around them, offering quiet words of support. Mrs. Wilson, Charlotte's mother, stepped forward and enveloped her daughter in a tight hug. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Charlotte nodded, though tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. "I just can't believe it, Mom. This was supposed to be a perfect day for Ethan." "It's still his day," Mrs. Wilson said gently. "We won't let this spoil it. Let's make sure he remembers this birthday for all the right reasons, not the wrong ones." Meanwhile, Mr. Wilson had taken a different approach. He stood near the edge of the yard, speaking quietly but firmly with a few of the other parents who had witnessed the police's arrival. They were neighbors, friends he had known for years, and he could see the anger simmering in their eyes as well. "This is unacceptable," one of the men said, shaking his head. "A bunch of kids having a party, and someone calls the cops. It's disgraceful." "I'm not surprised it was Mrs. Carter." Another neighbor, an older woman named Linda, muttered darkly. "She's always been like this, thinking she owns the entire street and doesn't want anyone who looks different from her around." Mr. Wilson nodded, his face set in a grim line. "This neighborhood has changed over the years, and most of us have welcomed that change. But some people," he trailed off, shaking his head, "some people still hold on to their old prejudices." As the adults shared their thoughts, the children had begun to gather near the bouncy castle once more, their youthful resilience shining through. For them, the police's sudden appearance had been strange, but not entirely understood. They were more concerned with who could jump the highest or get the biggest slice of cake. Ethan, however, was quieter than usual. He stood next to the bouncy castle, holding his balloon sword limply by his side, his earlier excitement replaced by a thoughtful frown. His best friend, Jake, approached him cautiously. "Hey, Ethan," Jake said, his voice low. "What was that about? Why did the police come?" Ethan shrugged, avoiding his friend's gaze. "I don't know," he mumbled. I think someone thought we were doing something bad." Jake looked puzzled. "But we weren't doing anything. It's just a party." Ethan's eyes filled with a mix of confusion and sadness as he glanced up at the house. He saw his dad talking to some of the other parents, his face serious, and his mom wiping away a tear as she spoke with her own mother. Ethan didn't fully understand what had happened, but he could sense that something was deeply wrong. Back near the table, Nathaniel raised his voice slightly, addressing the guests. "Everyone, I just want to thank you all for being here today," he began. "I know that was unexpected, and I'm sorry it disrupted the party. But we're not going to let it ruin this day. This is Ethan's birthday, and we're going to celebrate it together." A ripple of agreement ran through the crowd. People clapped and cheered, the energy slowly returning as they rallied behind Nathaniel's words. Charlotte took a deep breath, giving her husband a grateful smile before turning back to the cake. "All right, everyone," she called out, trying to inject some cheer back into her voice. "It's time for cake." Ethan, hearing his mother's call, perked up slightly. He ran over to the table, where the giant superhero-themed cake still stood, its candles unlit. The guests gathered around, forming a semicircle, their earlier concerns momentarily set aside. Charlotte lit the candles, her hand steady now as she focused on her son's bright eyes. "Okay, Ethan," she said, smiling down at him. "Make a wish." Ethan closed his eyes tightly, his small face scrunching up with concentration. He took a deep breath and then blew out the candles, the flames extinguishing with a puff of smoke. The crowd erupted into applause, and for a moment, it felt like everything was back to normal. But as the guests dispersed to get their slices of cake, Nathaniel noticed a small group of people standing near the fence, peering into the yard. He squinted, realizing it was Mrs. Carter and her son Richard, standing together with a couple of other neighbors. They were whispering among themselves, their faces marked with disapproval. Nathaniel's blood boiled. He had had enough. He handed his plate to Charlotte and made his way over, his steps purposeful. As he approached, Mrs. Carter turned to face him, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Lovely party you have here." "Cut the act, Mrs. Carter," Nathaniel snapped, unable to keep the anger out of his voice. "We both know you're the one who called the police." Mrs. Carter feigned surprise, her hand fluttering to her chest. "Me? Why?" "Nathaniel, I was just concerned. There were so many unfamiliar faces, and you know how things can be these days." "Stop," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. "I know exactly what this is about. You didn't call because you were concerned. You called because you don't like seeing people who look different from you enjoying themselves in this neighborhood." Richard, standing slightly behind his mother, looked uncomfortable, glancing away as if he didn't want to be part of this confrontation. But Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed, a cold fury flashing in them. "I've lived in this neighborhood for decades," she hissed. "I know what's best for it. And people like you, bringing in all sorts of strangers, it's not what this community was built on." Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He took a deep breath, fighting to keep his voice steady. "This community was built on families, just like mine," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "We work hard, we pay our taxes, and we love our children just as much as you do. If you can't see that, then the problem isn't with us. It's with you." Mrs. Carter's face twisted into a sneer, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned on her heel, marching back down the sidewalk with Richard trailing behind her, his head hung low. Nathaniel watched them go, his chest heaving with a mix of relief and lingering anger. As he turned back toward the party, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Charlotte, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and sadness. "You did the right thing," she whispered. Nathaniel nodded, his expression softening as he looked back at his wife. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I don't know if it's enough." Charlotte squeezed his hand. "It's a start," she replied. "And right now, that's all we can do." Together, they made their way back to the party, determined to salvage the day for their son. But even as they smiled and laughed with their friends, the incident lingered in the back of their minds, a stark reminder of the challenges they still had to face in the place they called home. "You said," whispers of change. As the day turned into evening, the golden sunlight softened into a warm glow, casting long shadows across the Thompson family's yard. Despite the earlier interruption by the police, the guests had done their best to carry on with the celebration. Children played tag around the bouncy castle, their laughter a soothing melody in the background. The adults gathered in small clusters, talking quietly, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. It was as if everyone was tiptoeing around the unspoken, trying to pretend that everything was back to normal when it clearly wasn't. Nathaniel stood by the grill, flipping the last batch of burgers. He tried to immerse himself in the rhythm of the task, the familiar sizzle of meat hitting the hot grate, the smell of smoke mingling with the sweet scent of blooming flowers. He had always found peace in grilling, a simple joy that connected him to his own father, who used to do the same at family gatherings when Nathaniel was a boy. But today, His mind was miles away, replaying the earlier confrontation with Mrs. Carter over and over again. He could still see her face, twisted with disdain, her eyes filled with something ugly and familiar. It wasn't the first time Nathaniel had encountered that look. He had seen it at work, on the streets, even at the grocery store. It was a look that told him he didn't belong, that no matter how hard he worked or how kind he was, to some people, he would always be seen as an outsider. It was a look that he had hoped his son would never have to see, but now he knew that was a naive hope. As he flipped the last burger onto a bun, Nathaniel felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see his friend Marcus standing there, holding 2 bottles of beer. Marcus was a tall, burly man with a booming laugh, but today his smile was subdued. "Thought you could use one of these," Marcus said, offering Nathaniel a bottle. "Thanks," Nathaniel replied, taking the beer and clinking it lightly against Marcus. They both took a swig, the cold liquid soothing Nathaniel's parched throat. Marcus leaned against the table, looking out at the yard. "You handled that well," he said quietly. "With Mrs. Carter, I mean. A lot of people wouldn't have kept their cool." Nathaniel let out a bitter laugh. "I don't know if I handled it well," he admitted. "Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her exactly what I thought of her. But what good would that have done? It would have just confirmed everything she already believes about us." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes darkening. "It's not right, man. We shouldn't have to put up with this crap, especially not in our own neighborhood. We've worked hard to get here, to give our kids a better life, and this is the thanks we get." Nathaniel's shoulders slumped. "I know, but what do we do? How do we fight against something so ingrained, something that's been part of this community for decades?" Marcus took another sip of his beer, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe it's time we start talking about it," he said. "Really talking about it. Not just amongst ourselves, but with everyone in the neighborhood. There are good people here who don't see things the way Mrs. Carter does. Maybe it's time we start bringing them into the conversation." Nathaniel considered this, staring down at the bottle in his hand. It was a daunting thought, opening up such a painful and complicated discussion. But maybe Marcus was right. Maybe the only way to change things was to start talking about the ugly truths that everyone preferred to ignore. "Maybe," Nathaniel said slowly, "maybe you're right. It's just, I worry about Ethan. I don't want him to grow up feeling like he doesn't belong here." Marcus placed a hand on Nathaniel's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "He belongs here, Nate. And so do you. So does Charlotte. And the more we stand up and speak out, the more people will see that." Nathaniel nodded, his resolve hardening. "You're right. It's time we make our voices heard." Meanwhile, inside the house, Charlotte was cleaning up the kitchen with the help of her mother, Mrs. Wilson. The 2 women worked in silence for a while, washing dishes and wiping down counters, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Mrs. Wilson broke the silence. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I've lived a long time, Charlotte, and I've seen a lot of changes in this country, in this world. But some things, it seems, don't change as fast as they should." Charlotte paused, her hands submerged in soapy water, and looked at her mother. "What do you mean, Mom?" Mrs. Wilson sighed, drying her hands on a dish towel. "I mean this prejudice, this hatred. I hoped that your generation, and especially Ethan's, wouldn't have to deal with it the way we did. But it's still here, lurking just beneath the surface." Charlotte felt a lump rise in her throat. "I know," she whispered. "I've tried so hard to protect Ethan from it. But today it felt like everything we've worked for, everything we've built, was just ripped away in an instant." Mrs. Wilson stepped closer, wrapping her arms around her daughter in a comforting embrace. "You're doing everything right, Charlotte," she said gently. "You and Nathaniel are raising him to be kind, strong, and proud of who he is. And that's what's going to make the difference. He's going to grow up knowing the truth, knowing that he belongs, no matter what anyone else says." Charlotte held on to her mother tightly, drawing strength from her words. When they finally pulled apart, She gave her mother a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Mom. I needed to hear that." Mrs. Wilson smiled back, her eyes warm. "Anytime, sweetheart. Now let's get back out there and make sure the rest of this party goes off without a hitch." Outside, the sun was setting, casting a beautiful orange and pink glow across the sky. The children had gathered around a small table to decorate cupcakes, their laughter ringing out once again. It was a small comfort to see them enjoying themselves after everything that had happened. Ethan was busy piling sprinkles onto his cupcake when he noticed a girl from his class, Lily, sitting alone on the edge of the yard. He frowned, setting down his cupcake and walking over to her. "Hey, Lily," he said, sitting down beside her. "Why are you sitting here by yourself?" Lily looked up at him, her blue eyes wide, and a little sad. "My mom said we might have to leave soon," she said quietly. "She doesn't want us to stay too late, because of what happened earlier." Ethan's face fell. "I'm really sorry about that," he said. "I don't know why the police came. We weren't doing anything wrong." Lily nodded slowly. "My mom said some people just don't like it when they see other people having fun if they don't look like them. It's not fair." Ethan's heart ached at her words. He was just a kid, but even he could see the unfairness in it all. "Well, I'm glad you came," he said. "I wanted you to be here for my birthday." Lily gave him a small smile. "Thanks, Ethan. I'm glad I came too." As the two children sat together, sharing a quiet moment, the adults continued their conversations, the seeds of change slowly beginning to take root. Marcus's words had struck a chord with Nathaniel, and as he moved through the crowd, he found himself talking to more neighbors about what had happened, about how they could work together to make their community more inclusive, more welcoming. For the first time in a long time, Nathaniel felt a glimmer of hope. It was a small spark, but it was enough. Enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, things could start to change. The party wound down slowly, the guests leaving in small groups, offering their thanks and well wishes. As the last of the daylight faded, and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Charlotte and Nathaniel stood together in the quiet of their backyard, watching as Ethan and his friends chased fireflies across the lawn. Charlotte leaned her head against Nathaniel's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Do you think we made a difference today?" she asked softly. Nathaniel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I think we did," he said. "It might not be obvious yet, but I believe we planted a seed, and now we just have to keep watering it, keep fighting for it." Charlotte smiled, squeezing his hand. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." And as they watched their son laughing and playing under the starry sky, they knew they were ready for whatever came next. Ripple effect. The morning after the party, the Thompson household was unusually quiet. The remnants of the celebration were still scattered across the backyard. Balloons deflated and tangled in the bushes, the bouncy castle slowly deflating, and half-eaten cupcakes left behind on the tables. Charlotte stood by the kitchen window, staring at the remnants of what should have been a perfect day. Despite the lingering joy of her son's birthday, the incident with the police and Mrs. Carter hung like a shadow over her thoughts. Ethan, however, seemed oblivious to the heaviness in the air. He was sitting at the dining table, happily digging into a bowl of cereal, recounting his favorite moments from the party to his parents. His small voice was filled with pure joy as he talked about the games, the presents, and especially the bouncy castle. "And Lily said it was the best birthday party she's ever been to," Ethan exclaimed, his face lighting up. Charlotte forced a smile, trying to match her son's enthusiasm. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said, her voice tinged with melancholy. She exchanged a glance with Nathaniel, who was sitting across the table, sipping his coffee in silence. The lines on his forehead were deeper than usual, his eyes clouded with concern. Just then, the doorbell rang. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat, her mind flashing back to the sight of police officers standing at her door. Nathaniel rose from his seat, his movements slow and deliberate. He caught Charlotte's worried expression and gave her a reassuring nod before heading to the door. When Nathaniel opened the door, he was surprised to see Marcus standing there, holding a large box. Behind him were a few other neighbors, some familiar, some less so, but all with expressions of determination. "Morning, Nate," Marcus said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We thought we'd come by to help clean up. We couldn't just leave you guys to deal with everything on your own after what happened yesterday." Nathaniel blinked, taken aback by the gesture. He looked over the small group of neighbors gathered in front of his house. Some were people he had exchanged only polite greetings with before, but today they looked at him with an unfamiliar warmth, a silent apology for what had happened. "Come on in," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with emotion. He stepped aside, letting them in. The group moved into the backyard, rolling up their sleeves, and immediately began picking up trash, dismantling the decorations, and folding up the tables and chairs. Charlotte joined them outside, her eyes widening in surprise. "What's going on?" she asked, looking at the crowd of neighbors. Mrs. Alvarez, an older woman who lived a few houses down, stepped forward. "We heard about what happened yesterday," she said, her voice filled with sympathy. "Some of us saw the police cars and heard what Mrs. Carter did. We wanted to show you that not everyone in this neighborhood feels the way she does." Another neighbor, Mr. Patel, nodded. "We've been living here for years," he said, "and we've always admired how you've become such a big part of this community. We can't let one person's prejudice overshadow everything you've worked for. So we're here to help, to show our support." Charlotte felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had never expected this outpouring of kindness from people she hadn't even realized were paying attention. It felt like a balm on the raw wound that had been left by yesterday's events. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "This means so much to us." Ethan, who had followed his parents outside, looked up at the adults with wide eyes. "Why is everyone here?" he asked, his voice full of innocent curiosity. Charlotte knelt down in front of her son, brushing a hand through his hair. "They're here to help us, sweetie," she explained. "To help us clean up after the party." Ethan nodded slowly, looking around at the people gathered in his backyard. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could sense that it was important. As the group worked together, the atmosphere in the yard shifted. The tension from the previous day melted away, replaced by a sense of camaraderie. People who had never spoken before found themselves chatting as they picked up trash or folded chairs. Nathaniel found himself talking to Mr. Patel about the local school district, while Charlotte laughed with Mrs. Alvarez about the antics of their respective pets. It felt like the beginning of something new, like the neighborhood was waking up from a long, quiet slumber. As they worked, a conversation began to take shape, led by Marcus. He had been thinking about what he had discussed with Nathaniel the night before, about the need for a deeper conversation within the community. Now, surrounded by neighbors who had come to show their support, he realized this was the perfect opportunity to start. "Listen, everyone," Marcus said, raising his voice just enough to get their attention. The group slowly gathered around him, curious. "I just wanted to say that what happened yesterday wasn't right. It shouldn't have happened. But I think it showed us something important, that we have some work to do as a community." He looked around, meeting the eyes of each person standing there. "We've all lived here for years, but how well do we really know each other? How often do we take the time to talk, to really get to know our neighbors? Maybe if we did, things like what happened yesterday wouldn't happen again." There was a murmur of agreement from the group. Mrs. Alvarez nodded, her eyes serious. "You're right, Marcus. We've all been living in our own little bubbles, keeping to ourselves. Maybe it's time we start reaching out to each other more." Mr. Patel stepped forward. "What if we started by having more community events?" he suggested. "Barbecues, block parties, things that bring everyone together. We could use it as a chance to get to know each other better, to break down some of these barriers." Charlotte, who had been listening quietly, felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. This was exactly what she had been dreaming of, a community where people looked out for one another, where they didn't just coexist but truly cared for each other. "I think that's a great idea," she said, stepping forward. "And I'd be happy to help organize something. We could start small, maybe a picnic in the park next weekend. Just a chance for everyone to come together and talk." The group erupted into a buzz of excited conversation, people tossing out ideas for food, games, and activities. It was as if a dam had burst, and all the goodwill that had been held back for so long was finally pouring out. As the cleanup continued, Charlotte felt a sense of lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. She watched as Ethan ran around with some of the other kids, chasing a soccer ball across the yard, his laughter ringing out like music. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that things could be different, that they could create a better future, not just for her son, but for every child in the neighborhood. By the time the yard was cleaned up, the sun was high in the sky, and the group had moved to the front yard, where they continued their impromptu meeting. People exchanged phone numbers, making plans to meet up during the week to start organizing the first community event. It felt like the beginning of something transformative. Nathaniel stood by the front gate, watching the group with a smile on his face. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this hopeful. When he saw Marcus approaching, he clapped a hand on his friend's shoulder. "You did this," Nathaniel said. "You got everyone talking." Marcus grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "We did this," he corrected. "It took all of us." As the crowd began to disperse, people heading back to their own homes, Charlotte and Nathaniel stood on their front porch, waving goodbye to their neighbors. When the last person had gone, they turned to each other, sharing a quiet moment. "Maybe this is the start of something new," Charlotte said softly. Nathaniel nodded, pulling her into a hug. "I think it is," he said, "and I think we're ready for it." They stood there for a moment, holding each other, the sun warm on their faces. Inside, they could hear Ethan laughing as he played with his toys, his voice filled with pure, unbridled joy. For the first time in a long time, the Thompson family felt like they were truly home. "You said, a new dawn." As the weeks passed, the Thompson family settled back into their routines, but the ripples from that fateful birthday party continued to spread across the neighborhood. Something had shifted. People were no longer just neighbors in proximity, but were beginning to engage as members of a shared community. Nathaniel and Charlotte noticed small yet significant changes. Morning greetings became more genuine, lingering longer in the smiles exchanged on the sidewalks. People waved at each other from their cars. Even the local kids, including Ethan, had forged new friendships that extended beyond the usual playdates. One Saturday morning, a new kind of buzz filled the air. Today was the day of the first neighborhood gathering, a community picnic at the local park. This wasn't just any picnic, it was a new beginning, an attempt to reshape the fabric of their neighborhood. The gathering storm. As Charlotte and Nathaniel packed the car with picnic supplies, Ethan ran around excitedly, his tiny sneakers squeaking on the pavement. His energy was contagious, and Charlotte couldn't help but smile. Today felt different, a good kind of different, filled with anticipation and hope. When they arrived at the park, a sight that filled them with unexpected joy greeted them. Dozens of families were already setting up. Blankets were spread out on the grass. Picnic baskets opened, and the smell of grilling burgers and hot dogs wafted through the air. Children ran around, playing tag, while adults set up folding tables loaded with food. Charlotte glanced at Nathaniel, who had a grin on his face. "We did it," she whispered, squeezing his hand. Nathaniel nodded. "No," he corrected her gently. "Everyone did it. This is what happens when people come together." As they made their way to their spot, they were met with warm greetings from people they barely knew before. Mrs. Alvarez brought a tray of homemade tamales, smiling widely as she handed one to Ethan. Mr. Patel, who was busy setting up a game of cricket with his kids, waved them over enthusiastically. Just as the festivities began, Marcus took the lead, calling everyone together. He stood atop a small hill, looking over the crowd, his voice strong yet filled with emotion. "Friends, thank you for coming," he began. "A few weeks ago, many of us witnessed an incident that reminded us how quickly misunderstandings can divide us. But look at where we are now." He gestured to the crowd. "This is what unity looks like. We are here today not just to have fun, but to start building bridges that will hopefully last generations." A round of applause broke out, and as people began to mingle, something magical happened. The lines that had once divided them, race, age, language, seemed to blur and fade away. Facing old wounds. The Thompsons were busy setting up their blanket when Charlotte noticed Mrs. Carter sitting alone on a bench at the far end of the park. She was watching the gathering with a stern expression, her lips pressed into a thin line. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and made her way over. Mrs. Carter didn't look up when Charlotte approached. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. "Hello, Mrs. Carter," Charlotte said finally, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm glad you came today." Mrs. Carter scoffed slightly, her gaze still fixed on the crowd. "I didn't come to join in," she said curtly. "Just watching from the sidelines. I still don't see the point in all this display." Charlotte swallowed hard, but she refused to be discouraged. She knelt down beside the bench, so they were at eye level. "I know we've had our differences," she began, "and I know that you were the one who called the police that day." Mrs. Carter flinched at the directness of the statement. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her cane. "I don't blame you entirely," Charlotte continued, her tone still calm. "I think you acted out of fear. But that fear comes from not knowing us, from not understanding that we're more alike than you might think." Mrs. Carter's eyes, sharp and cold, met Charlotte's for the first time. "You think you know me," she snapped. "You don't know anything about me or why I did what I did." Charlotte took a deep breath. "You're right. I don't know everything about you, but I do know that this is our chance to start fresh, to get to know each other, to move past whatever preconceived notions we've held on to." For a long moment, Mrs. Carter said nothing. Then she let out a deep sigh, her shoulders sagging as if a weight had finally been lifted. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Maybe it's time for a change. I've lived here for over 50 years, seen this neighborhood change more than once. But this is the first time I've seen people come together like this." Charlotte smiled, a real, genuine smile. "It's never too late to be part of something good, Mrs. Carter." The old woman looked back at the crowd, a softness entering her gaze. "Maybe I'll just sit here a bit longer and watch," she said. "Maybe next time I'll join in." Charlotte nodded, standing up. "That's a start," she said. "And you're always welcome." New beginnings. As the day wore on, the park buzzed with life. Nathaniel was deep in conversation with a group of neighbors about organizing a neighborhood watch to keep everyone safe and informed. Marcus led the kids in a game of soccer, his booming laughter echoing across the field. Charlotte watched it all unfold, her heart swelling with pride. Ethan was playing near the playground when he saw a group of kids gathered around a new face. It was a boy about his age, standing off to the side, looking shy and unsure. Without hesitation, Ethan ran over and introduced himself. "Hi, I'm Ethan. Do you want to play?" he asked, holding out a toy car. The boy hesitated for a moment before taking the car. "I'm Aiden," he said quietly. "I just moved here." Ethan grinned. "Cool. I can show you all the best spots in the park. Come on." And just like that, a new friendship was born, as simple and pure as only children can manage. Charlotte watched her son, a smile spreading across her face. This was what she had hoped for, not just for Ethan, but for the entire neighborhood. A place where no one felt like an outsider, where everyone had a chance to be seen and heard. The sun sets, hope rises. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the park, People slowly began to pack up their things. The first neighborhood picnic had been a success, filled with laughter, new friendships, and the promise of a brighter future. Nathaniel and Charlotte stood together, watching as the last of their neighbors headed home. Marcus came up behind them, clapping Nathaniel on the back. "We did good today," Marcus said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "We sure did," Nathaniel agreed. He looked over at Charlotte, his eyes shining with gratitude. "This is just the beginning." Charlotte nodded, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "We had a lot of work ahead," she said. "But for the first time, I feel like we can do it, together." As they gathered their things, the Thompsons walked home, hand in hand, with Ethan skipping ahead. The darkness of the previous weeks seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of lightness and hope. When they reached their front door, they paused for a moment, looking back at the park. The echoes of laughter and the sight of children playing lingered in the air, a reminder of what they had achieved together. Nathaniel squeezed Charlotte's hand. "This is our home," he said softly, "and it feels like it now, more than ever." Charlotte smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Yes," she agreed. "It really does." They stepped inside, closing the door behind them, and as the sun set, casting its last light over the neighborhood, a new dawn of understanding and community was just beginning to rise.